Welcome to Decision 2018, the U.S. House of Representatives Candidate Forum. Today, we turn our attention to the U.S. House of Representatives race in Michigan's 3rd Congressional District. Today's forum with our first guest was recorded Tuesday, August 21st, from the studios of the Meyer Public Broadcast Center at Grand Valley State University. Now let us begin by introducing U.S. Taxpayers Party candidate Ted Gerrard from Grand Rapids. Ted, thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me, Patrick.
Not your first go-round. You also ran in this race, 2 years ago?
2 years ago, and also in 2010.
A lot has changed in those 2 years. One in particular involves the environment. We are having issues with PFAS being discovered in private drinking wells in Belmont and in Rockford. In your opinion, what is the government's role in this discovery and in the research and in the cleanup when it comes to the government and with the EPA?
The government's role would be to ensure that the truth is revealed as far as cause and fault, and also that the cleanup or cleanup measures that are necessary to care for the citizens is carried out in a reasonable manner.
We'll move on to immigration. Immigration greatly debated in this country. How would you fix the immigration system if you were a member of Congress? What would be the path to citizenship? Should there be a wall? How would we finance it? There are a lot of tentacles here when it comes to the immigration policy.
Well, there's two immensely different immigration situations. There's the southern border, which has a large number of people coming across that are dealing in human trafficking and drugs and gang violence, and we really need strong measures to curtail that. Then there's the general immigration issue where we're bringing people in from around the world as students and professionals, and that system actually needs to be made easier in many cases. If somebody wants to come to our country to add to the benefit of our country, and we need them, then the system for them to come in should be good and easy. But the system for criminals to come in should be very difficult. We should not be capturing people 10 feet inside our border and housing them in our prisons for 6 to 8 months trying to figure out if we should send them back or not. It should be a quick turnaround.
In that circumstance, is there a path to citizenship that works?
For the criminals or for...
In general, with the current setup that we have in this country. Would you change the system, I guess?
The system to citizenship right now, or even legal immigration status, to be here as a legal resident, is cumbersome. I have a few friends who have been through the system, and one was told by her attorney that the best way to do this is to actually outstay your visa because it will get you a court date.
And that's the system? That's
the system.
I asked about a wall, funding a wall. Is that something that you're in favor of or opposed to?
A physical wall, depending on how you do it, is ridiculous for the entire length of the southern border. A virtual wall, giving the Border Patrol freedom to do their jobs is very important.
Healthcare, also something debated in this country, much like immigration. The Affordable Care Act was implemented a few years ago.
Sadly.
And we'll get to that. So, Affordable Care Act, is this something that should be repealed, replaced? Replaced? Let the market determine health care in America? Where do you come down on the issue?
So the Affordable Care Act gives the government control over our personal health care through the mechanism of finance. And we have seen two things to be true of things the government controls. Number one is they get expensive, and number two, they don't work well. So that is definitely a negative for government-controlled health care. The other end of the spectrum, when you have strictly privatized or private sector for-profit, you then have market forces determining who is best, and those same market forces bring prices down. Does there need to be regulation in there? Yes. Does there need to be accountability in there for those who harm their patients or put forth bad drugs for whatever reason? I mean, how many commercials do you see on TV of, call us, we're suing this drug manufacturer? Well, that drug was approved by the government, or it wouldn't be on the market. So we need a true accountability system for those who are producing the drugs and are providing the health care.
So that's the sweet spot, is to find some type of regulation.
Correct.
Where would that regulation come from?
Well, it has to come from state government according to the Constitution. And then when you start with the interstate medical practices, it would have to come from the federal government according to the Constitution.
We're going to get into economics here. Just about every politician I'll talk with will say job creation #1. So I guess, how would you create jobs? Secondly, we're in an era where tariffs are now impacting the economy. Give me your sense of how you feel about the economy now, a type of policy you would like to see Congress embrace, and then of course yourself as a job creator.
Well, myself as a job creator has been creating and growing businesses over a period of 20 years. And so I know how the process works. I just started a trucking company this year, and I'm still finding out a new form that has to be filled out and submitted every day. The cost of establishing a new business in the United States is phenomenal. The trucking business is more intense because you're impacting a lot of people when you're driving on the roads, large vehicles and so forth. So there is more to it than when I established the electrical contracting business 18 years ago. But the amount of regulation that's involved, filing a form every year to tell the government that I'm still doing business under the same name at the same address, that is a duplicate of a form that I have to file every year that says what the name of my business is and what address I'm doing business at.
So rolling back, regulation is one way to get the economy going.
Getting regulation out of the way and not tying the hands of people who are trying to grow business. But again, accountability for those who step out and cause injury to others in whatever manner that may be.
Your feeling then on the tariffs, is this the right course of action?
Well, again, if we look back at what the founders put in place, the mechanism for funding government was fees and tariffs. And prior to the 16th Amendment, that worked just fine. 16th Amendment brings in income tax, which is effectively penalizing an individual for working instead of causing them to pay when they receive a service or a good. So the tariff is the constitutional direction to go. But changing a mechanism, any part of the economy, always causes ripples.
And so you would reverse course on what we're seeing now?
I agree that tariffs need to be put in place for certain products. Something I've been saying for years is we would apply a tariff or fee to imported products that are manufactured in a manner that do not meet our human rights and environmental standards. That would bring up the human rights and environmental standards around the world and would also cause more things to be manufactured in the U.S.
We'll stick with the Constitution. Second Amendment, we've seen some mass shootings at schools over the past year. We're seeing 3D printing of guns. I know we're going to come down on this, but is there sensible regulation out there, or is the Constitution pretty plain?
Well, the Second Amendment says what it says, and it's pretty cut and dried. And again, I come down on the side of accountability. I've seen cases, as an example, after the incident outside of St. Louis, there were 2 officers assassinated in New York City. They traced the purchase of that firearm back to a pawn shop in Georgia, and they traced it to 2 legal owners after that. The second legal owner went, "Oh, I don't know what happened to that gun." That gun killed 2 police officers, and that man that was reckless with the firearm was not held accountable. When we start holding people accountable for the actions that they take or that others take with the tools that they've provided, then we will see some change.
So you feel that the laws are in place, they're just not being implemented as they should be?
There are many laws in place concerning manufacture of firearms, use of firearms, and the 3D printing of firearms. If you manufacture a firearm, near as I can see when I read the regulation, it doesn't say how. When you manufacture a firearm, you can keep it and use it personally. But if you hand that to Patrick, you must register it first. Must have a serial number recorded with the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives.
You know your acronyms.
Yes.
Foreign policy. Do you feel the United States responded appropriately to Russian meddling in the last presidential election, and what should the foreign policy be towards Russia?
I've still seen no evidence that Russia mingled in our election. I understand they put a lot of posts on Facebook, and they may have donated to the Hillary campaign, but other than that, I've seen no evidence of it.
So even national security departments that have provided the information, you say, didn't happen?
I've not seen the evidence. I've heard a lot of hearsay, I've heard a lot of rhetoric, I've not seen any actual evidence put forth.
All right. Energy policy. What should the country's energy policy be? A lot of people will say it's put everything on the table. We're seeing CAFE standards on vehicles potentially being rolled back in time. There's debate over coal-fired power plants and their role. The energy policy as you see it for this country.
So coal-fired power plants, when the smokestack emissions are handled properly, I believe they can be as clean or cleaner than natural gas-fired plants. The transportation of coal is a little more environmentally aggressive than natural gas. Natural gas comes through a pipeline, coal comes on trains. CAFE standards, again, I'll look at the trucking business. There's a US truck manufacturer that teamed up with a European truck manufacturer as far as powertrain, and the engines that they're using in the European environment, which has higher environmental standards than we do, is a good performing high horsepower engine that doesn't have maintenance issues. We put it in a US truck with the equipment necessary to meet our EPA standards, and it's junk. The horsepower is about 60% of what it is in Europe. The breakdowns increase by about 30%. Why is that? Why can't we have an engine in the US that works fine and meets standards in Europe? Why can't we have that work fine and meet our standards here?
Is it the regulation in place, or what are you saying?
It's the necessary equipment that we need to put on our trucks to meet the regulatory standards. So I would say that we go to the guys that love diesel engines and making them perform and say, hey guys, come up with a plan for clean emissions, good horsepower, and something that doesn't break down.
The opioid addiction. We're seeing this across the country. It's at this point a crisis. What is the government's role in trying to tackle this issue?
Prescription or street drugs?
Well, from prescription, then it turns to illicit street drug use. I mean, you see the connection that's been taking place there.
Yeah. Again, I have been interacting with people struggling with addiction for probably 30 years. So this is personal. The government's role is not to just lock them up. If we're going to take them out of society, we need to treat the core issues, which the majority of the time is psychological and spiritual, not physical. And my observation is when we treat the core issues of psychological and spiritual matters that often go back to the ages of 8 and 10 years old, the person becomes free of the need for the addictive medications.
Because we're seeing that two-pronged attack right now in some ways. It's, prosecutors, law enforcement trying to remove the drugs, but then there's that transition with people who are addicted to these opioid painkillers.
There's the medical side,
Yeah.
which, whatever the medical issue, whether it's alcohol, drugs, or a broken arm, needs to be addressed with compassion and the good medical science. But the long-term solution to addiction is not prison. It's not arresting people for buying or selling, whatever it is. The long-term solution is a matter of the heart and the mind.
Ted, this is the best part of the interview right here, the last question.
I don't know if I'm prepared for this one.
Sure you are. Great Lakes funding. The debate goes on every year about funding the Great Lakes. We live in the Great Lakes state, right? We have 4 out of the 5 Great Lakes surround this peninsula of ours. What is the dynamic at play? What should we be protecting when it comes to the waters here in our state?
Well, as I understand it, there is a group that is made up of the leaders of the states, Wisconsin, Illinois, Ohio, Michigan, Minnesota, Pennsylvania, New York, and Ontario, province of Ontario, that has been in place for decades, that have been focused on the concern of maintaining clean water in the Great Lakes. And I believe that group has done a good job overall. It's prevented shipping the water to California, for example. Is federal funding required for that? You could argue it either way because there are multiple states involved, so it does come under interstate commerce. But it's not a national issue. One of the biggest problems we have with water in Michigan is private enterprise putting down 10, 12, and 20-inch wells and sucking the aquifers under farmland dry. You can go up here in the areas of certain companies' facilities and you can see pond levels are lower than they were 10 years ago. And that's benefiting that one business, good for them, but it's impacting cattle, corn, soybean, and all the farmers and families that rely on those crops. And that would be strictly a state regulation. The federal government, effectively, 10th Amendment, has no right to intrude into the state with regulation. But they do it fairly well through the funding mechanism.
So states should fund their own water resources protections.
States should take care of themselves, and as we have been for decades, working with the adjoining states to maintain the Great Lakes.
U.S. taxpayers candidate, Gerrard.
Thank you, Patrick.
Thank you.
It's been a pleasure.
You too. Thank you.